Let me read to you a passage from the 23rd chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, verses 1 to 12. It's the Gospel for Saturday of the 20th week in Ordinary Time. St. Matthew writes, "Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, 'The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for men to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted in the marketplaces and to have men call them Rabbi. But you are not to be called Rabbi, for you have only one Master, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth your Father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called Teacher, for you have one Teacher, the Christ. The greatest among you will be your servant. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." That's from Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 to 12. What does it suggest to us? Well, of course, it speaks about humility. What do I mean? Well, at times one sees references to Jesus as a social revolutionary who opposed authority in society and religion, attempting to overturn the corrupt institutions of his time and place. There is no doubt that the religious authorities felt threatened by Jesus. Pilate could see clearly that their implacable hostility was due to jealousy. The people hung on his words and were struck by his holy authority. The core leadership, though not all the leaders by any means, hated him, the leadership of the nation. But it must be remembered that our Lord in no way opposed their office and class as such. In our Gospel he commands respect for their office and obedience to their proper and best teachings, which is to say, in the legitimate exercise of their office. As we heard, Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you." He himself is found dining in the home of Pharisees. The scribes and Pharisees may be largely credited with enforcing in the nation the Sabbath observance, which was a linchpin of Jewish life. But, he says, do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. So our Lord's principal critique of the scribes and Pharisees was of their own practice of religion and the bad example they gave of self-exaltation. Now, while our Lord in our passage today commands religious obedience to them, we know from elsewhere in the Gospels that he did criticize many of their prescriptions on how the Sabbath was to be observed, their prescriptions on the practice of the Korban, and various other matters. But it was the heart of their religion which our Lord especially condemned. They fiddled and fussed with human regulations meant to protect the weighty matters of God's law, but forgot and neglected in their own lives those weighty matters of love, justice, and true adoration of God. They lived in self-exaltation. John the Baptist called them a brood of vipers, and our Lord called them whitewashed sepulchres. Our Lord feared the contagion of their example, for they were the leaders. He did not want his disciples to be seeking their own glory in their religion. Accordingly, he says, everything they do is done for men to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted in the marketplaces and have men call them Rabbi. This self-exaltation was at the root of their oppression of others, precisely in religion. Our Lord says they tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. The burdens of religion which they imposed enforced their sense and practice of power. They gloried in their titles and made of them a means of personal exaltation. As the religious leaders, they did not serve, but sought to be served. Christ's disciples were not to take their cue from them. But you are not to be called Rabbi, for you have only one master and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth your father, for you have one Father and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called teacher, for you have one teacher, the Christ. The greatest among you will be your servant. Our Lord, of course, was not condemning the use of titles as such. He himself gave to Simon a title. It was Peter the Rock. Simon thenceforth was known for this title, and was his by Christ's designation. Christ called James and John sons of thunder, a kind of a title. He gave to John the Baptist the title of prophet. He said to his disciples that he was indeed their master and their Lord. When speaking to Nicodemus, he said of him that he was a teacher in Israel. And doubtless our Lord would have allowed Nicodemus to be addressed as such. What our Lord was condemning was the self-exaltation in such practices. They ought to have been the occasion, the titles, of humble service. It was a title of service. That's what the title was for. At the Last Supper, when our Lord concluded his washing of the feet of his disciples, he said, "You call me Master and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am." So it was right to use these titles, but they expressed humble service. It was legitimate for his disciples to use appropriate titles, such as Apostle, Rock, and others in later history, provided they expressed Christ-like service and humility before God and man. The title was a title of service. Life is short and eternity is long. Let us use every day to grow in the Spirit of Christ, who left aside the glory and position that was his as God and became as we are, indeed humbler still, even to death on a cross, as St. Paul writes. But God raised him up. Thus does our Lord conclude his words with this ominous and yet exhilarating dictum: "The greatest among you must be your servant, for whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." Let us make that the program of our everyday life.